Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Hey everyone, Craig Baird here. Before I begin today's story, I want to take a moment and ask that you check me out on Patreon at www.patreon.com/CanadaEHX. There are several tiers with great benefits, from ad-free content to t-shirts and other cool stuff. And if you're a fan of Canadian History X, make sure you check out my other shows, From John to Justin and Canada, A Yearly Journey. And don't forget, you can also donate directly to the show at www.canadaehx.com. It helps keep this show going. All right, on with the show. The Dark Mirror is a forgettable film. The psychological horror centers on a woman accused of murdering her doctor boyfriend. But wait, she has an evil twin she didn't know about. A twin expert, which is a thing in this movie, is brought in to determine which one is good and which one is an evil murderer. Honestly, if you want to see a good twin, evil twin story, watch The Thing and I in The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror 7 from 1996. Regardless, The Dark Mirror was released on October 18, 1946, and it grossed $2.75 million at the box office to mixed reviews, but it did pick up an Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay. And the film did something else. It changed Canadian history when a young woman sat down at the Roseland Film Theatre in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, on November 8, 1946, to watch The Dark Mirror while her car was being repaired. She never saw the end of it. She was thrown out. Her crime? Sitting in a place meant for whites. I'm Craig Baird. This is Canadian History X, and today I share the powerful story of the woman who now graces our $10 bill. This is the life of Viola Desmond. February is Black History Month, and over the next 4 weeks I'm sharing important stories of Black Canadians to celebrate. Now, before I continue, this episode does contain dated language. It's being used as examples of how people spoke at the time and does not reflect current views. We're starting off with Viola Desmond, who was born on July 6, 1914 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Her father, James, was a barber and a prominent member of the Black community, while her mother, Gwendolyn, was white. The couple worked hard to raise their 10 children while facing backlash from the white community for their interracial marriage, which wasn't accepted, but they were welcomed into the Black community. The family lived a quiet and happy existence in Halifax until one day it was nearly shattered. On December 6, 1917, Viola was 3, and she was sitting at the kitchen table in her high chair with her back to the window. She was having breakfast with her siblings. Her father was taking care of them while their mother was on a train heading to a family funeral with the oldest and youngest sons. Without warning, a massive blast wave hit the home, sending Viola's sister Emily to the floor. A few moments later, over 100 kilometers away, the train Viola's mother and brothers were on was also rocked by a shock and stopped. Viola's father, James, raced from the bathroom and found her sitting in her high chair with the window blinds resting on her head. Her eyes were closed and her fists were clenched. The blinds actually protected her from the shattered glass that was blown into the house. She only had a small scratch. Viola and her family had just survived the Halifax explosion. As you might remember, it was the largest man-made explosion in human history to that point. And while nearly 2,000 people died on that day, the Desmond family was lucky and only suffered minor injuries. Things would go back to normal for them. Viola grew up, made friends, and generally lived a good life. And while she did experience racism, as did most Black residents of Nova Scotia, it was a different kind of racism. Unlike in various states in the United States, Canada was never officially segregated. Our segregation was more hidden, informal, and enforced by the white community. Nova Scotia Lieutenant Governor Mary Ann Francis, the first Black Nova Scotian to serve in that post, said, "The racism in the United States was truly in your face. In Canada, the racism was very polite, sort of undercover." This undercover racism was seen repeatedly across the country. In 1936, a Black man named Fred Christie attempted to buy a beer at a tavern next to the Montreal Forum. He was denied service and told, quote, "Colored people are not served here." His case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, who ruled that the tavern had acted within the law, and if the man was humiliated, it was only because he was so persistent in demanding service. Viola ran into similar discrimination throughout her life. One of the few jobs available to black women was teaching, and she briefly taught at 2 schools that were racially segregated. Her father had worked hard for the family, and he instilled that work ethic in Viola. She was not content to be a teacher. She wanted to be her own boss. She eventually applied to beauty schools in Nova Scotia, and she wasn't accepted because of her race. She had to travel to Montreal to attend field beauty school, then acquired further training in Atlantic City and New York City before returning to Nova Scotia. In Halifax, she opened Vi's Studio of Beauty Culture, and her business quickly became a success as black women went to Viola to have their makeup and hair done weekly. With growing success, Viola decided to give others the opportunity she never had, so she opened the Desmond School of Beauty Culture. Her school quickly grew as students came from as far away as Quebec. Each year, 15 women graduated from her school. And along with her studio and school, Viola also sold her own branded beauty products for black women throughout Nova Scotia. With all her hard work, Viola seemed to find success around every corner. She was happily married, her business was thriving, and Viola was happy. Until destiny got in the way. Like the flap of a butterfly's wings, producing a hurricane halfway across the world, the things that really change the world are tiny. You just don't know it at the time. In The Vocation of Man, Johann Fisch said, "You could not remove a single grain of sand from its place without thereby changing something throughout all parts of the immeasurable whole." And on November 8, 1946, Viola Desmond was that grain of sand. The day started normal enough. She left her Halifax home for Sydney, Nova Scotia on a business trip. It was a 4-hour journey she had made countless times along nearly the entire breadth of the province. The Atlantic Ocean to one side and rolling hills to the other would be her companions to her destination. But about halfway into her drive, her Dodge sedan began to make an odd noise. Something was wrong, and with hours to go, she had no choice but to limp the vehicle into a mechanic in New Glasgow. Viola dropped off her car as the mechanic told her the repair would take a few hours. So with time to kill, she remembered seeing a movie theater on her drive in. Viola worked a lot, and now, with plenty of time on her hands, a movie was a welcome respite. It wasn't hard to find the theater, the Roseland Theater, which featured a large neon rose on the top of the marquee that shone like a beacon. The large brick building didn't look like much from the outside, but it was a large theater that featured a balcony. But that balcony had a nefarious use. It was meant to separate black customers from whites. But it didn't start out that way. A few years earlier, in 1941, local white customers complained about black customers sitting with them in the theater. So to satisfy the white customers, the theater decided segregation was the answer. White customers got the floor seats, black customers the balcony. It was common knowledge among those in New Glasgow that the Roseland Theater, along with several other businesses, were segregated. Viola, however, was unaware when she purchased tickets for the 7 p.m. show. She was nearsighted and she wanted to sit closer to the screen so she could see the movie. She asked for a floor seat, and Peggy Melanson at the front desk gave her a ticket for the balcony. Her balcony ticket cost 30 cents with a 2-cent tax, while the floor seat cost 40 cents with a 3-cent tax. Remember that. It's an important detail. Viola didn't notice the change in seating and gave her ticket to the usher, Prima Davis. She started to walk to what she thought was the floor seat when Davis stopped her and told her that her ticket was for the balcony. Viola thought nothing of it and simply believed that a mistake had been made. She said, "The cashier must have made a mistake. I asked for a downstairs ticket. I will have this exchanged." When she returned to Melanson and asked for a floor seat, Melanson said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not permitted to sell downstairs tickets to you people." And that's when Viola realized there had been no mistake. The seller may have thought that was the end of it, but she didn't know Viola. Viola saw how white Halifax residents treated her parents for their interracial marriage. She knew of the segregation and racism her husband Jack had experienced his whole life. She was not going to be forced to sit in a balcony seat because of her race, unable to see the movie that she had paid for. She walked back to the floor seat and sat down. She said later, "As the downstairs auditorium was just partially filled with people, I could see no reason for her refusal, so I went inside and sat down." The theater manager, Henry McNeil, walked in and told her she had to sit in the balcony because the ticket was cheaper than the floor seats. Viola told him she would pay the difference. McNeil told her he had the right to refuse admission to any objectionable person. She replied that she had not been refused admission because she was holding a ticket in her hand. At this point, McNeil had 2 choices. He could have accepted that Viola just wanted to watch a movie and shouldn't be denied a place to sit simply because of the color of her skin. Or he could be on the wrong side of history. I'll let you guess what he chose to do, because a few minutes after his conversation with Viola, a police officer arrived to drag her out of the theater. And as she was pulled out, she was injured. In her affidavit, she said, "The police officer grasped my shoulders and the manager grabbed my legs, injuring my knee and hip. They carried me bodily from the theater out into the street." She nearly lost a shoe in the process, and a bystander picked up her purse and brought it to her when she dropped it. Thrown into a taxi, she was taken to jail. After Viola was put into a cell, Elmo LaGill, chief of police, and McNeil left but returned an hour later with a warrant for an arrest on a trumped-up charge for tax evasion. She spent the night in a jail cell. And although she was frightened, she was not about to let anyone see her as anything but composed. Viola sat for 12 hours, upright and stoic, as those around her slept off drinking binges. The next day, Viola was taken to court. She couldn't be charged with violating segregation laws because none existed. Instead, she was charged with refusing to pay a 1-cent amusement tax and defrauding the provincial government. That 1 cent was the difference in tax between floor and balcony seats. See? I told you to remember the taxes. Viola, who was given no legal representation, pleaded not guilty. She said later, "I was not told by the magistrate that I had the right to have counsel, nor was I told that I had the right to have an adjournment and be bailed." She argued she had offered to pay the tax difference, but Henry McNeil refused to accept her money. The cashier said she sold Viola a ticket for the balcony, and the usher stated she asked her to move from her floor seat. The offer to pay the difference and the ticket price was not mentioned by either of them. McNeil said, "There are no instructions issued by either me or the Odeon Theaters stating that downstairs tickets are not to be sold to colored persons. However, it is customary for them to sit together in the balcony." The judge ruled against Viola. She was charged $26 in fines, $6 of which went to Henry McNeil. After Viola returned home, she told her husband Jack about what happened. He had grown up in New Glasgow and was well aware of the segregation practices in his hometown. He told her to let it go. He said decades later, "They told her there were no coloreds allowed downstairs, and she didn't know that. I knew it because I grew up there." Jack may have wanted her to drop the issue, but others were not about to let that happen. The Nova Scotia Association for the Advancement of Colored People began to raise money to help Viola fight her conviction. And another person joined the fight. Someone who had also had experience with racism at the Roseland Theatre. Carrie Best. Carrie Best deserves her own episode, and one day she will have it. But for now, she will just be part of Viola Desmond's story. Carrie Best was born in New Glasgow in 1903 and spent her whole life there. She saw and experienced the racism in the community. Unlike Viola's husband, Carrie was not about to let things go. In December 1941, she heard that several black high school girls were removed by force from the Roseland Theatre after they tried to sit on the main floor. To show solidarity with the girls, Best and her son Calvert went to the Roseland Theatre, told the owner he was racist to his face, and then went and sat in the floor seats. The theater owner immediately called the police, and both Best and Calvert were charged with disturbing the peace. The civil lawsuit for racial discrimination against the Roseland Theatre was thrown out, and like Viola, Carrie had to pay damages. But the experience inspired Best to create The Clarion in 1946, became the first black-owned and published Nova Scotia newspaper, and became integral in the battle against racism for Viola Desmond. Volume 1, Issue 1 of the newspaper reported on her fight against the Roseland Theatre along with her photo, and it helped bolster support which was growing. On the advice of her doctor who treated her injuries, Viola hired a lawyer to sue the Roseland Theatre for false arrest, false imprisonment, and malicious prosecution. The lawyer would have a similar choice as the theatre manager: racism or the right side of history. Frederick Bissett made the right choice. Frederick Bissett was a white lawyer, and when Viola walked into his office, she saw a 44-year-old man in the prime of his career. He had grown up in Halifax and attended Dalhousie University before setting up his practice. By the time he met Viola, he had 20 years of experience under his belt. He would be an excellent choice to represent her. Viola's legal fees would be paid by the Nova Scotia Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and because of his experience, Bessette chose a different approach to the case. Rather than argue the case on the basis of racial discrimination, which Bessette believed would fail in Nova Scotia, he chose to appeal on two grounds. The first was that Viola was denied due process in her arrest, while the second was that the evidence of tax evasion was insufficient. And while he was a great lawyer, the case never made it to trial. Today, due process, or the presumption of innocence, is a major part of the judicial process. It's the principle that the government must respect all legal rights a person has under the law. Pulling someone out of a theater without charges and throwing them in jail is not due process. Unfortunately, back in the 1940s, it was still a relatively new concept, and it didn't hold up in court, so his first argument was thrown out. Bessette's argument about tax evasion evidence being insufficient also failed to make an impact as the court ruled that there was a difference in the ticket costs between seats. Later, the Canadian Bar Review stated that Bessette should have argued that the courts had no right to enforce racial segregation. This would have forced a decision on the legitimacy of that argument, which could have ruled in Viola's favor. In one last-ditch effort, Bessette applied to the Supreme Court to have the criminal conviction put aside. On January 20th, 1947, Court Justice Maynard Brown Archibald ruled against Viola. He stated the decision of the original magistrate should have been appealed to the county court. Justice William Lorimer Hall added that if that appeal had been done, quote, "There may have been opportunity to right the wrong done to this unfortunate woman. One wonders if the manager of the theater, so overzealous because of a bona fide belief that there had been an attempt to defraud the province of Nova Scotia the sum of 1 cent, or was it an endeavor to enforce a Jim Crow rule by misuse of a public statute?" Unfortunately, the 10-day deadline for filing an appeal in the county court had long since passed by that point. There was nothing that could be done. And when that appeal failed, Bessette refused to bill Viola for his services. This allowed the money to go to the Nova Scotia Association for the Advancement of Colored People to help others in the province. And while Viola Desmond lost the battle, she would win the war. After Viola's court case, the Clarion and the NSAACP mobilized to bring change to end the treatment of black Nova Scotians as second-class citizens. In July 1947, 2 months after Viola's case was heard, Maclean's ran an article asking if Canada was truly a free country. It cited her unfair treatment, the jailing of strike leaders like Madeleine Perron, and the wartime internment of Japanese Canadians. And slowly, public opinion began to swing. In 1954, segregation legally ended in Nova Scotia, although the last segregated school wouldn't close until 1983. For context, I was just about to start daycare that year. That's how recent that was. In 1963, the Human Rights Act was passed in the province. 4 years later, the Human Rights Commission was established to investigate complaints about racial discrimination. Sadly, despite her part in ending segregation in Nova Scotia, the last years of Viola's life were difficult. After the Rosedale incident and the subsequent court case, the marriage between Viola and Jack began to fall apart and the two eventually divorced. A few years later, Viola closed her business and moved to Montreal, where she enrolled in business college. While on a trip to New York on February 7, 1965, Viola Desmond died from gastrointestinal bleeding at only 50 years old. The Halifax Chronicle-Herald in her obituary said nothing about the Roseland Theatre incident and didn't mention her part in the fight for equal rights. That recognition would come way later. For years, Canadians knew the story of Rosa Parks, but few knew the name Viola Desmond. That began to change thanks to Viola's sister, Wanda Robson. When she was 73, she enrolled in a course on race relations at the University College of Cape Breton. The instructor was Graham Reynolds, and one day he began covering Viola Desmond's experience. Robson spoke up and shared that he was talking about her sister. Realizing that the story of Viola Desmond had sat in the shadows for too long, Robson and Reynolds began to tell the story. In 2010, Sister to Courage, written by Robson, was published, and that got the ball rolling. On April 15, 2010, Nova Scotia Lieutenant Governor Marianne Francis officially pardoned Viola Desmond, and then the honors for Viola poured in. First a stamp in 2012 and then a Heritage Minute 4 years later.
All I wanted was to see a movie. One down, please.
I can't sell downstairs tickets to you people.
How dare they? I could afford to buy the more expensive ticket. I run my own business. But they refused to take my money. They left me there all night. On what charge? They said I didn't pay the theater tax. But it was really about color.
Sister Desmond, appeal this conviction and your community will stand behind you.
Do you have any idea what this will do to us?
So what are you going to do? Make it right.
Viola Desmond's case inspired Nova Scotia's civil rights movement. She was pardoned 63 years later based on the injustice of her conviction.
Viola earned a star on Canada's Walk of Fame in 2017, followed by a Google Doodle on July 6, 2018. But perhaps the greatest honor came on November 19, 2018, when the new $10 banknote featuring Viola Desmond was released. The next time you pull out a $10 bill out of your wallet to buy your morning coffee, look at the woman staring back at you from the banknote. Her life and Canada's future changed when her car broke down and she chose to see a movie. I hope you enjoyed that episode and our look at Viola Desmond. Next week, we're looking at George Dixon. This show is researched, produced, and written by me, Craig Baird, with the help of Dila Velasquez. Audio production and design by Rosalind Kufor. If this is your first time listening and you like what you heard, please take a moment and give us a 5-star review to help other people find these amazing stories. And there are so many for you to sink your teeth into. If you enjoy this podcast, then please check out my other podcasts, From John to Justin, Canada, A Yearly Journey, Pucks and Cups, and Canada's Great War. We love hearing from you, so if you have a show topic you want me to cover, email me at craig@canadaehx.com. Or stop by my website and social media. I'll include all of those in my show notes. Until next time, I'm Craig Baird, and this is Canadian History X.